Okay, so now we'll talk about external validity. So external validity asks the question, are your claims about generalizability valid? So remember, validity is always a property of a claim, not about a method. And so in this case, we're talking about claims like, we found that being happy makes people more generous. So this is a pretty broad claim. And what the researchers actually looked at is much more narrow. So for example, we could ask, well, what do they mean by being happy? Or what do they mean by people? Or what do they mean by more generous? And we might, if we look more closely, find out that by being happy, specifically what they looked at was what happens when people watch a funny video. And when we ask what they mean by people, we might find out that they specifically looked at students at the University of Melbourne. And what they're talking about as being more generous, what they actually measured was whether students were more likely to donate 5 cents to a bushfire relief fund. So they're making claims about happiness, but really what they only looked at one narrow slice of happiness, which is the feeling you have after watching a funny video. They're making claims about people, but they really only looked at a thin slice of people. And they're making claims about generosity, and they looked at one way of being generous. So we can ask, is it valid to generalize beyond what they actually looked at to what they're making a claim about? So we always have to extrapolate beyond our data. We measure things, but we really want to know something broader than what we are able to look at. So external validity asks, are those extrapolations valid? And we can extrapolate near or far from what we actually looked at. And the farther we extrapolate, the riskier it is. So if I only study undergraduate students at the University of Melbourne and I want to extrapolate to all university students in Australia, that's less risky than if I want to extrapolate all the way to all people in the world, for example. So the chances of having good external validity get lower as our extrapolations get broader and broader, or further and further away from what we actually measured. So some ways we can extrapolate beyond what we actually did. We can extrapolate to other populations of people, like in the example I just gave, where I only looked at University of Melbourne students, but I wanted to make a broader generalization, maybe to all Australian university students, or maybe even to all people in the world. But I can also extrapolate to other ways of measuring our constructs, so other operationalizations of, for example, happiness or generosity. So if I don't just want to claim that it's watching a funny video that makes people more generous, I really want to claim it's that feeling you have, however you get it, whether it's from watching a video or something else that makes you happy, that's going to produce the effect. And same thing with generosity. I might want to go beyond claiming that being happy only affects how much you donate to bushfire relief funds. And I want to make a more general claim that being happy makes you more generous. And you can also extrapolate to other settings. So for example, if I did my study in a lab on campus, in a room that was under the experimenter's control, I might want to claim that this would hold in the field. So if companies could make people happier when they're using their website, then those people might be more generous even when they're sitting in their own home. Or maybe I want to generalize from a university context to a business context. That would be extrapolating to a different setting. So some common threats to external validity include, and these are pretty obvious, extrapolating to other populations without good reason. So if I'm jumping from one narrow sample to a much broader population, and there's reason to worry about that. So sometimes a narrow sample is very different than the population I want to generalize to, or we have reasons to worry that it might be different. Or if I want to extrapolate from the lab to the real world, so importing findings in the laboratory to businesses or classrooms or just everyday life, that can be risky, especially because often lab studies are designed in such a way to exaggerate the effects they're studying by isolating them from all other factors. So if I want to look at whether happiness causes more generosity, I'm going to manipulate happiness. I'm going to keep everything else constant among the happy and less happy group, and see if I see a difference in generosity. But that might be unrealistic. In real life, we're being pushed and pulled in many different directions. We have moods that we come into our experiences with. We have environmental stressors, etc. So that's a big reason to be careful about extrapolating from a kind of artificial lab setting to a more complex and messy real world setting. It's also risky to assume that an effect would apply to other operationalizations, other ways of measuring or manipulating the predictor variable. So for example, if I find that extroverts tend to live longer, that might only be true for one way of measuring extroversion. Maybe my measure of extroversion had some items in it that tap into health behaviors or something like that. And so if I use a different measure of extroversion, I might not find the same association. Same thing with assuming the effect would apply to other outcome measures. So if I find that extroverts live longer, I might be tempted to conclude that therefore extroverts are healthier in general, but maybe that's not true. Maybe I should be careful to generalize from living longer to other signs of physical health. Okay, so some solutions to dealing with these threats to our external validity. If we do want to generalize broadly or a little bit more broadly than our initial design allows us to, we could consider changing our design to have a broader range of participants. So if I want to make a claim about Australian university students in general, maybe I can try to sample from more than just one university, or I can try to sample from a broad range of settings. So if I want to make claims about business settings, then maybe I should try to run my study in a few different businesses. Try to sample from a broader range of ways to operationalize my measures. So try different ways of inducing happiness and different ways of measuring generosity. And more broadly, thinking about different ways to tackle the same research question. So if I want to be really confident that there's a link between happiness and generosity, for example, I probably ideally would want to design several studies that get at that in different ways. So some that rely on a lab-based study with university students, some that I could run online with a broader population, and try to think of creative different ways to test this question that all get at the same broad claim I want to make about happiness and generosity. And if you do this, if you actually intentionally vary your sample of participants or settings or operationalizations, et cetera, you can actually statistically model that variation and ask, does it matter if I vary the population or the setting and so on? And you can actually find some really interesting, cool effects that way. If you do find it matters, that can be really interesting and sometimes gives you theoretical insight into what's going on. If you consistently find, for example, that this works when I manipulate happiness with a funny video, but it doesn't work when I manipulate happiness another way, then that might tell you something about what's the active ingredient that's causing the effect. So you might learn something interesting. So there's some debate about how much we should actually care about external validity. You'll see a lot of basic science papers that are not meant to be applied say we don't really care about external validity because we're not trying to implement this in an applied setting. Now that's less relevant for applied research, of course, but even then I think we should be skeptical of this. So even when we say that our studies are interesting for purely theoretical reasons, we don't think they have applied consequences, even then, we want to make sure that our result is not due to some strange, uninteresting quirk of our study. So, the specific way I recruited participants, maybe my flyer had a theme that actually attracted a certain kind of participant, and the finding only held because of that. And if I had a different recruitment flyer, I would have gotten a different sample and the finding wouldn't have held. I really want to know that, because even if I'm not trying to make broad generalizations and apply my findings in the real world, I still care if my finding depends on some strange quirk of the study. So I still want to make sure I do it a few different ways and rule out as much as possible that my finding is really, really narrow in this uninteresting way. So we always care about external validity, at least for some very close generalizations. I at least want to say that it would work if another experimenter tried the same thing I did, or if I did it on a Tuesday instead of a Saturday, or if I did it in Adelaide instead of Melbourne. Most of the time, I really care that those things are still true when I change such minor, irrelevant details. And also, we often do want to make broader generalizations. Often, we do care about some applied context where our finding might be applied, maybe not today, but down the road. So we almost always care quite a bit about external validity, whether we realize it or not.